Everything modern really begins with minerals. If you care about energy, data, defense, food, water, you already care about mining, you just don't know it.
Vivek Salgaocar is the founder of Prospect Innovation, a pioneering ecosystem that helps startups and innovators build, pilot, and scale frontier technologies for the natural resource and mining industries. He is a director at the Vimson Group, a global family-owned conglomerate operating the fields of mineral resources, real estate, and financial services.
What limits is not really the imagination or the software, it's really the minerals. The technology is going to be the thing that moves this industry forward. Everyone wants to be first to be second.
Welcome, Vivek. Many of our listeners probably have not thought a lot about mining. Why is this industry so crucial for everybody to understand?
First of all, thank you for having me, Philip. So I think the thing about mining is that it is invisible until it stops, right? So everything modern really begins with minerals. So if you care about energy, if you care about healthcare, if you care about data, defense, food, water, you already care about mining, you just don't know it, right? And I think that's why mining really matters, is because it touches literally everything that we are in contact with in our day-to-day lives. We just perhaps don't realize it. And so it's been this kind of black box that nobody really pays much attention to, but that's slowly changing now. And I think what's fundamentally important to realize is that what limits is not really the imagination or the software or things like that, but it's really the minerals, because if you don't have the materials to build what it is that you want, you can't really go anywhere, right? And so how we mine is actually probably what matters more than how much we mine. And so why it matters is, well, if to anyone listening, if your future is important to you, mining should matter.
That's a good way to put it. And you're at a very interesting point because you're at the intersection of finance, mining, and technology. What do you think, from your perspective, makes this point in time in the industry so transformative?
So I think what we have right now is a rare convergence of economy, geopolitics, and technology, right? And what I mean by that is that you're seeing, especially this year, I think more than than ever before, as well as the last few years, minerals are becoming an issue of national security. And so you have governments that are trying to secure these supply chains, and similarly, then corporates are doing the same. That's on the geopolitics side. Similarly, with the economy, if you don't have the ability to secure your raw materials, you can't really build and grow and develop, as economies. And then lastly, on the technology side, there's all this talk about AI infrastructure build out. Data centers, semiconductors, whether you want to talk about electric vehicles then and electrification in general, all of these things really depend on the minerals. And so why this moment is transformative is that you have all of these factors suddenly coming to a head all at once. And so therefore, it's not something that you can ignore anymore, but really it's a moment in time where all of these factors are contributing towards this massive push towards increasing the amount of minerals that we mine, but also how we mine them. And that's where the technology piece, which is where we are most closely involved, comes into play.
And what's the biggest misconception people have about mining?
Well, in my opinion, I think the biggest sort of misconception is the fact that mining is dirty and outdated and unnecessary, or some combination thereof, right? I think the reality is that you can't really have, whether it's batteries, data centers, defense, etc., you can't have any of that without mining. You can't have solar panels without mining. You can't have wind turbines without mining. So you can't really, you can't be as kind of reductive in terms of the definition or the perception. But really what you need to look at mining as really is an enabler. And once you look at it through that lens, what you change is then the focus on how you do it rather than whether or not to do it. So the aim is not, to mine more or to stop mining or anything like that, but the aim is really how we can mine smarter. And so if you have, gains in terms of cleaner processing and circularity, et cetera, all of that contributes to it. But the misconception, I think, is that, mining is this thing that we have to kind of, hide away or ignore or stop altogether. That's impossible if we want to really have the life that we have, set ourselves out to be in this industrialized world. Plus, of course, given what we want to do going forward into the future, it's only going to require more of it. And so therefore, we have to do it in a better way.
And one of your projects is Prospect Innovation that you launched. It's an innovation ecosystem in the mining industry. Could you talk a little bit about this and what motivated you to start it?
Sure. So really with Prospect, it was a frustration that then became a mission. And what I mean by that is that, so I come from a family business that's been in mining for 3 generations and over 80 years. And what I was trying to do was to see how we could improve the operational efficiencies that we had in our company by bringing in early stage technologies and startups and things like that, breakthrough cutting edge technologies from anywhere else in the world that we could use to improve, our operations. Now, what I saw, much to my surprise, which was then, that frustration that I mentioned, was that there was no real ecosystem that was independent that existed really anywhere in the world. And that was not just, in India, where we're from, like I said, but across all types of mining and metals, right? So not just iron ore, but really across the board. And so the mission became then to build this bridge for founders and operators, because I had seen in other heavy industries that there was this massive kind of step change that came about in the industry when you were able to get young entrepreneurs and technologists who perhaps were looking at things in completely different ways to really change the way in which these processes were. And so that became kind of the main sort of North Star for Prospect Innovation, which was to see how we could bring these technologies into an industry that was notorious for being very, very, very slow to adopt new technologies and innovate. And so what Prospect Innovation now is really a global community where we try to, bring in folks from all sorts of different fields, all sorts of different industries. And the understanding being that we can kind of be the bridge towards the mining industry and really turn these pilots to purchase orders, so that it's not just some kind of esoteric community, but something that is real, that is rooted in an operational base, and is something that can really drive the industry forward.
And can you give one example maybe of a breakthrough technology that is now being piloted in the industry that really excites you?
Sure. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and these are companies that we're privileged enough to have been a part of from an early stage, and also we have been investors in. So one company is called Nth Cycle. They're based out of close to Boston in the U.S. And what they set out to do was really use electricity instead of heat and chemicals to extract high purity nickel product from black mass, which is what you get out of recycled batteries. Now, what that means is that when you use electricity, you have a lower footprint because you're not using as much energy for heat. You're not using as many harmful chemicals. So it's not only a lower cost, but it's also a lower footprint for the environment. We were lucky enough to participate in their seed round about 4 years ago. Last year, they went to market with their first commissioned plant in Ohio in the US. So why that's really amazing is that they were able to look at this in a modular way, which actually now enables them to be the only licensed producer of nickel in the entire US, which, given what's happening with geopolitics, is extremely, extremely important. Another example I'll give you, where we are also investors and also involved, is a company called Genomiines. They've come out of France. And what they are involved in is something called phytomining, which is essentially using wild species of plants to be able to extract from the soil through the roots, right? So this is something that seems almost sort of science fiction-y, but actually what's fascinating is that it goes back to the very beginning of mining, where a lot of the the big deposits in mining that were identified back in the day were identified because on the surface you saw certain species of plants that existed because they liked the the elements and the minerals that were underneath. And so this kind of uses that, but really at scale, genetically modifying them to be able to extract these elements from either, tailings deposits or overburden or fresh mines. And what this means is that, sites that perhaps were not considered to be mineable are now suddenly, sources of raw material. So I think what this also shows is that there is a diversity in terms of the types of technologies, but there's also a diversity in terms of where these are coming from, right? So these are coming from all over. The examples I gave you were from the US and France. We're currently evaluating a nickel extraction company that's looking where they're piloting in Chile, another one that's looking that's looking at a different mineral that's coming from Australia. So really, this is quite global, and that's what makes it even more exciting.
And when we look a little bit into the future, let's say 5 years into the future, which technologies are you most excited about in the mining industry?
So I think what's important when it comes to mining is that this is not something that can be switched on or switched off or changed overnight, right? So 5 years in mining terms is really a very short period of time. So what I would say is that the technologies that will have the biggest impact in 5 years are technologies that are almost getting ready to be deployed now, because it I wouldn't say like perhaps in other in other sectors where if there's a great idea now that could in 5 years be a huge make a huge impact. Sure, that's possible, but the likelihood is low. And so what I would say is really the impact follows the installation, so to speak, right? So technologies such as looking, those that look for circular solutions, I think would be very interesting, because recycling is going to be very, very important. It also becomes the cheapest form of extraction because the primary extraction has already been done. You're just looking at pulling it back out of a finished product. Electrification is going to be something that's going to be very, very impactful. And that's not just in mining, but really across the industrial world. Precision exploration, I think, is something that's very, very important. And what I mean by that is trying to figure out in a better way where we can actually mine, because that's something still that's a very big problem. Also, because the quality of the ore bodies or the quality of the deposits is really declining, because the ones, the highest quality ones have already been discovered and have already been mined, and so the newer ones are going to be more and more difficult to discover. So if you can do it in a more precise way, that's going to be hugely, hugely impactful. Having said that, and kind of going back to what I said at the beginning of the response, mining is definitely something that you have to think about in terms of decades or generations. And so, we also look to support and back some of the kind of moonshot type, longer horizon plays, because those are going to be what eventually help, boost the industry. And mining is not something that's going to go away in 5 years. It's not going to be something that's going to away in 50 or perhaps even 500 years, right? So we have to look at the future while, of course, looking at the kind of not so distant future as well.
Mhm. And a lot of the things that you talked about were technology related. Do you also see that these technologies are changing the business models in the industry?
Yeah, so I think one of the things with that I've said a couple of times again is with mining is that it has been slow to adopt, right? So what happens when there is that inertia, when there is that hesitation to adopt to new technologies, the onus is going to be a lot more on the startups, right? So they have to, I think, do a lot more work to convince the end users or to convince the miners to use them. So I think in terms of the business models or themes that are changing or that are coming about, that are perhaps in some ways unique to mining, or particular or different when it comes to mining, is that in some cases you have to kind of, the provider or the technology company has to prove the value, right, before really anything is going to be tested or used. And in some cases you have to also be willing to get paid based on the results rather than just getting paid based on what you say you can deliver, just to make it a little bit more appealing for the mining companies to actually take you on and use your product, right? So that's one where it's sort of outcome based services. Another is I think data based subscriptions, where every mine is generating tons and tons and tons of data. What that means is that you're going to have business models that are really going to turn that data into better daily decisions, because of how much more information you get on every part of that value chain. And in terms of a business model, that changes the way in which you do things, because you can act a lot faster. You have to be a lot more nimble. You can't just kind of, make these long-term plans and stick to them and refuse to change, because this data that's being generated real time and processed real time is going to be something that really, gives you that insight, but you have to be agile enough to actually take that insight and act on it. And I think the last one is going to be, in if you talk about a broad sort of theme for the business model, is really circularity and sort of offtake, right? Where in a perhaps utopian world, you could have almost it be a metal as a service, where you are looking at the whole circularity of providing a metal, and then eventually also re-extracting it from from the product after its after the end of its life. And so the idea being there is that what was considered to be waste in the past suddenly now can be considered to be feedstock. And that becomes, very interesting. If you can do the whole circle, that's great. But there's also a lot of business models that are focusing purely on taking that waste and really repurposing it, or extracting from it again, so that you reduce the need for fresh mining, because you already have a lot of this waste that you can process.
Mhm. And you mentioned now a lot of different things. Could you piece these together maybe for our listeners into what your vision for the mine of the future would be, and what would it look like?
Sure. So I think, when it comes to the mine of the future, I think one thing that will not change is that it'll still be large and complex. I think what has to be appreciated and realized that mining is a fairly complicated technical industry. And so, the mine of the future is not going to be something that, is completely invisible and happens, in a very different way. It will still be in many ways similar to what it is that you see today. However, what will change is perhaps a smaller impact, and what that means is that you have less waste because you're able to to drill and extract in a more precise way. You will probably have a lot more electrification. You will definitely have a lot more data that's being generated and being used. And so I think those are, some large themes that we would see in terms of the mining of the future. So you could have a situation where with AI you have, plants that kind of tune themselves autonomously. You could have, real time mapping. All of these things which otherwise are done by humans today and take a lot longer. There could be a lot more kind of real time action there when you talk about the mine of the future. But I think going back to what I just said in the previous response, I think for me, ideally, what the mine of the future would actually be a situation where you are extracting from what was considered to be waste or tailings or overburden from the past. And what I mean by that is that, when you're extracting when you're extracting ores from the ground to actually then refine it into metal, what you actually pull out from the ground contains, for the most part, waste, right? Or things that are not going to be usable, or at least what was not thought to be usable. To give you an example, when you talk about iron ore, high quality iron ore is say 65%, which means you still have 35% that's not what you want in terms of your final finished product. If you get to things like rare earths, etc., it's more than 99% that's considered to be waste or overburden, right? Now, if you had a situation where all of that waste material that has been set aside could actually become your new source of feedstock, you don't have to go into the ground again and have this primary extraction, which is, by the way, the most expensive and has the highest impact. So the mine of the future to me could actually be a situation where you're only mining this waste and extracting what you need from it, thereby reducing the need for primary extraction and reducing then the costs, reducing the emissions, reducing the impact on the environment.
Mhm. And you frequently mentioned that mining industry is a bit slow to adapt. Some people might say risk averse, maybe, and there are many other industries like that as well that are very risk averse. So, could you, based on your experience, maybe give some advice to decision makers? How can you make more risk averse industries adopt innovation?
Sure. So I don't know if I can give advice necessarily, but I think, one thing to kind of keep in mind with mining is that it's a continuous process, and it oftentimes is a continuous process over decades. So downtime is super expensive, which is why there is also a hesitation to try something new, because if you stop your operation to try something new and it doesn't fail, there's lost revenue because you stopped your operation. There's increased cost because of restarting the operation. But of course, your experiment has failed, and so there's reputational risk. And in many cases, you could lose your job, for instance, right? If you've taken that decision. So there's a lot of forces that push against being really very innovative in a mining context. But having said that, I don't think now it's a choice. I think it's a need and a necessity. So you can't be in a situation where you're going to say, I'm not going to use technology, I'm not going to try new things, because your competition is going to do it. And if you don't do it, you're going to get taken over. And so I think, in terms of what is going to be important for getting risk-averse operators to adopt, I think part of that burden also lies on the solutions and on the entrepreneurs to actually be able to work extra hard to get that proof of concept, to get that data, to show that there is really value that is being derived from their solutions, rather than just saying that, okay, the mining industry is not going to adopt, so therefore we're not going to touch it. It's funny because one of the most common sayings in the mining industry is that everyone wants to be first to be second, which basically implies that nobody wants to be the first one to give it a try, because they're afraid of failing. But once they see some sort of successful technology being deployed once, everybody's going to rush to get it. And so if you can kind of break that barrier as a startup to get into just one company that adopts you, I think you'll find that many others will do the same. And from a miner's perspective, to give, I think, to be a little bit more open to giving those types of technologies, of course, within reason and with sufficient data and protection and security, etc. If you give those a chance, you'll find, I think, that there's massive upside to be had. And given that a lot of these are commodities, every little bit counts in terms of margin, right? And if you can get that sort of head start, that's going to be huge in terms of bottom line.
And talking about the entrepreneurs, you mentioned them. If you had one piece of advice to innovators entering the mining space, what would it be?
So I would say, what's really important is to focus on the problem, not necessarily the solution. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes what we see is that we find, very many super smart, super intelligent, researchers, technologists, innovators, entrepreneurs, etc., who are very, very, very caught up in the technology that they have built, that they lose focus on whether or not that can actually solve a certain problem that exists, or whether it's a problem that's big enough, to be commercially viable. And then ultimately, those companies fail, right? So we've seen that happen far too many times. And so rather than, just being overly obsessive on the technology, I think in order to be an innovator with a successful company, you have to have that product market fit. You have to focus a lot on it. You have to speak to the operators, not just someone who understands the theory of it, but someone who actually has the experience in operating these mines, to see if that solution is something that can be deployed. Because again, you have to earn that trust. That's not something that's going to come, especially in an industry that's been notoriously hard, to crack when it comes to innovation and technical adoption. Which is why, again, the onus is on the innovator. So you have to keep pushing, you have to keep trying, you have to keep getting that data. You have to really speak the language that the operators use and the mining companies use, because they're the ones who need to be convinced. And they're not going to be just convinced with some fancy technology. You have to have a situation where you actually are saving them costs, or increasing safety, or improving the amount of extraction that they're getting. So they have to see value in it, rather than just being expected to adopt something that is very, very, very sort of revolutionary as a technology, but doesn't really match the need at hand.
One of the topics that we see in the news pretty much every day is critical minerals, rare earth. It's really becoming a geopolitical issue. How do you see innovation shaping the resource security space?
So first of all, just to kind of clarify, you have, there's a lot of terms that are thrown out, and just to kind of clarify, you have critical materials, which could be sort of anything, including non-mineralized materials. You then have critical minerals, which minerals are what you then move to extract metal out of, and then you have rare earths, which are a smaller subset of it. Oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they're actually technically quite different. So for instance, coal, for instance, in some matters is considered to be critical material because you need it for energy, you need it for power. It is not a critical mineral because it's not a mineral, right? So minerals are inorganic versus coal, which is organic. Not to get too technical, but that's just something that people use interchangeably. That's perhaps not not always accurate. Rare earths are a very, very small subset of it, which have become I think something that people are talking about now because of what happened, post April 7th, when China essentially stopped the the export of these rare earths, right? Now, the thing is, when you talk about innovation and resource security, right? Innovation does not change the geology. The geology is the geology. What exists underneath wherever you are in the world is what exists, where you are. What innovation does change is the access, the efficiency, and the resilience. And what I mean by that is that, wherever you are in the world, if you have the technology to actually extract what it is that you need in an economical way, you then are less dependent on other countries, right? And yes, in certain cases, you have other countries that have a massive concentration of a certain type of mineral, but that doesn't mean that that mineral doesn't exist anywhere else, right? To take your example of rare earths, China does not have the only rare earth deposits in the world. They just so happen to have been, the most aggressive in terms of developing them, in terms of processing them. They have a massive head start. They've invested billions into it. So that's why it's obviously going to be harder for others to keep up. That does not mean that rare earths do not exist in other countries. So when you talk about resource security, if you actually have the ability to develop technologies that can extract these rare earths at scale in an economical way, you can actually completely remove dependency on other, geographies, because you can find them in your backyard, literally. It's just a question of being able to develop those technologies. And if there is enough money and capital, et cetera, that's moving towards, this field, it'll encourage more and more people to work towards this, which means you'll have a much faster roadmap for these technologies to be, developed and adopted. Which means ultimately you're going to reduce dependence on other geographies or other countries for having these materials. And that's something that I think is very, very possible. It has to happen, step by step, but it has to happen very quickly, because otherwise you're going to have this massive dependency, and countries are going to be hamstrung, as we have been seeing, because of how much they depend on other countries, for exporting those products to them.
Yeah, and you said it has to be done quickly. What would be a realistic time frame for this? Because you also said it's like usually long-term projects.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, in an ideal situation, it should have been done yesterday, right? But it's not something that can be done in a hurry. I think China has almost, I would say, a 30-year head start, and several billions of dollars that have been put into it. So it's not something that you can say, yes, we can take another 30 years to get to where they are, because by that time they have another 30 years of a head start, right? So you have to do things differently, which is where technology comes in. You have to do things in a way that kind of leapfrogs the existing incumbent technologies, which give you the ability to do it in a much faster way, right? So if you ask me to put a timeline to it, it's impossible, because these technologies perhaps don't exist today. So I can't say that, okay, in 3 years, this is going to happen. In 5 years, this is going to happen. You could see a situation where nothing happens for a few years, and suddenly, in a couple of years, you have a whole bunch of these technologies that people have been working on that suddenly click and work, and you have this big, big sort of upswing. But it's really hard to put a timeline because of how complicated and how technical mining is. But also, in addition to that, the way you mine one mineral is different from the way you mine another. So it's not that you can say, okay, I'm working on a technology for extraction in mining. It has to be specific to a certain mineral. And even within minerals, you have, nuances and sort of particularities that you have to address. So that's what increases the complexity of it and increases the time and money that's needed. But I think given the, the vulnerability that that countries have seen and the national security angle, related to that as well, countries are now more willing to put money behind it. And so therefore, I think that timeline has been sped up. But if you ask me, is this something that's going to be completely, solved in 10 years? Absolutely not. It's something that's going to be, continuous because of the nature of it. But, the dependencies and the vulnerabilities can greatly be reduced, year by year, if we kind of go down this technology route, because that's the only way you can actually leapfrog the incumbent technologies, as I said, and really get to that sort of fighting chance, because otherwise it's going to be the same situation that we're in right now.
Yeah. And many technologists are actually quite optimistic about things that seem quite crazy to many people, like asteroid mining in space or deep sea mining. Is this something that you think we might see in our lifetime?
Look, so we get this question all the time, because these sorts of things get headlines, right? Because they seem very fascinating, very sci-fi. So let's take one at a time, right? So asteroids. So the thing with asteroid mining is that it's not a mining problem. It's a space problem. What I mean by that is that we know how to break rock. We know how to extract from rocks. We've been doing it for many, 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 many years, going back to the Bronze Ages, right? What we do not know, and what we have not figured out yet, is how to take equipment to space and back economically, or once we extract it, to bring it back economically. That's not something that's going to happen. And so it's more of a haulage and space problem rather than a mining problem. So the situation where I see asteroid mining being viable is if we actually do want to build in space. So for instance, if we want to colonize Mars, if we want to build stuff on the moon, then it makes more sense to mine it on the moon and build on the moon, or mine on Mars and keep it there and build on Mars, rather than saying, we mine on Earth and take it there, or mine there and bring it back to Earth, because the transportation of it is going to just kill the economics and make it absolutely impossible. So again, not a mining problem, but it's more of a space problem, for lack of a better term. When it comes to, the oceans, of course, the oceans are a lot closer. However, interestingly enough, I heard a stat, that we know less about the oceans than we know about outer space, right? So even though it's closer to us, we know very, very, very little about the oceans, and therefore the bar to actually get, this deep sea mining going must be very, very high, because we know so little about it, right? The science has to be very, very strong. The understanding of the ecology has to be very, very, very strong. The rules have to be extremely clear, and there has to be consensus, because otherwise, we might start something that we don't know how to really fix, or we don't know what the repercussions or the results are going to be. And so really, when it comes to deep sea mining, do I see it happening? Yes, I do, but I think there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done, and rightly so. From a regulatory and scientific kind of understanding point of view, before we really do it at scale, right? So I think what's important is to perhaps start slow and understand, and if the signs point to stopping, I think we absolutely should stop. So when it comes to these, as you said, sort of crazy ideas, yes, there are pathways and routes, but ultimately we have enough on Earth in terms of terrestrial mining, and so I think that's where there's enough that we can sort of play with, rather than having to look at asteroids or the floor of the ocean. Plus, in addition to that, if you are able to really extract from waste, as I was mentioning, that again reduces the need to go to these other frontiers, because you have all of it on land, and that's ultimately going to be possibly the most straightforward and possibly the cheapest way to extract these minerals as well.
I also want to talk about your own leadership journey a little bit. So, what have been the toughest moments for you in leading change in a very traditional industry?
So I think the hardest part was going first, right? So this is an industry that's been around for thousands of years, that will be around for thousands of years, and moves very slowly, right? So to be the first, and this is going back about 7 or 8 years ago, to be the first to be like, okay, look, we're going to now bring in this futuristic technology into an industry that has been hard to to push towards being innovative, etc. The conversations were very difficult, because most of the time you would lose the room, right? And that's whether starting with my own with my own background, where we come from a traditional mining background, and there itself there's obviously resistance, because this is something completely new. So convincing just close to home, convincing our own the folks at our own company, let alone others, but then also having these conversations with people outside in the mining world, in the equipment manufacturing world, there was very, very, very strong resistance to doing this, because the idea was, look, it's been going on forever and it's fine, so why do you really want to change it? And so for me, that was almost this kind of motivation, where hearing no that many times kind of kept me going, because I felt like, okay, if everyone is saying no, I think there's something there, because if everyone was if it was kind of mixed, then I think some people would actually have already been doing it. But the fact that everyone is saying no means that it's never been done before. So why should I not be the one to to do it? Now that idea is, I think, becoming a lot more mainstream, and that's really rewarding to see, because we've been kind of at the from the foundation of it, we've been really, really at the forefront of this, I would say, movement, so to speak. And really, technology is going to be the thing that moves this industry forward, and it's fantastic to be to be a part of it.
You mentioned your family business. So, what has been the biggest lesson for you in bringing together family business and innovation?
So there's this famous watch brand who says you first need to master the rules before you break them. And I think that is in many ways similar to kind of moving from family business to innovation. And what that means is that, with family business, you're in a situation where you have no real job description. You have to really understand every aspect of the business. You have to get fully entrenched. You need to know things backwards and forwards. And once you get that, once you understand this, the current state of affairs, that's where innovation comes, where you can actually, then go out and break some of these rules by changing some of these, these paradigms that were perhaps assumed to be constant and things that could never change, right? So what definitely helps when it comes to the family business aspect of it is that kind of concept of thinking in generations, and protecting reputation and protecting the communities and the environment in which you operate, right? I think that is something that has always stuck with me and has been important in terms of how we look at companies, how we help them, how we invest in them, how we support them, because ultimately that's something that is going to be very, very true to the mining industry, regardless of whether it's more innovative or not. And so therefore, if you are, looking at innovation and startups that are going to be adopted by the mining industry, you have to keep those kind of core principles at heart, which are common to family business, common to mining, that persistence, that resilience, but that focus on kind of those around you and the environment around you. That's going to be very, very important. And to ultimately be patient, and really do things thoroughly, but also move fast. I think that's the really the kind of confluence of the family business side of things and the innovation side of things.
And what skills do you think that the next generation of leaders in the mining industry will need that today's leaders don't?
I don't know if I'm necessarily the best person to ask that, because I wouldn't consider myself to be, the leader of the mining industry, so to speak. But also, I think the question also implies that there's certain skills that perhaps current leaders of mining industries don't have. I think there's been a significant shift where people have realized that agility is super important. Openness to technology is super important. You need to keep that technical base with mining, but you also have to have an open mind towards new technologies that can perhaps replace it or really change it, right? So it's I think in terms of the skills for the next generation of leaders, it's not so much saying that okay, there's certain skills that that previous leaders didn't have, but it's really building on these skills, and looking at being perhaps more agile, more adaptive, while still having that strong understanding of the technicalities of the industry, having that real strong connection with the communities around you, the environment around you, but ultimately, being comfortable with things like data, with real-time decisions, right? Partnering across the value chain, measuring outcomes, scaling what it is that works, trying new technologies. I think those are things that are going to be very, very important, and ultimately is going to be something again that's not going to be a nice to have, but a need to have, because ultimately competitors are going to adopt that mindset, and the smaller to mid-sized companies are going to have less to lose and so much more to gain, and they're going to be the most hungry and the most adaptive, which means that the larger mining companies have to do the same. And to be fair, if you look at really whether it's the larger mining companies or the mid-sized, I think across the board you're seeing this big push towards technological adoption. And so in terms of, skills for the next gen leaders, I think that's something that's already being imbibed. It's just a question of, doing more of it. And so I do think that's, that's happening. It's just a question of, how fast you can move and how well you can adapt without really compromising on what it is that's needed to continue, the operations of the existing businesses as they are.
Mhm. And we like to end the show on a positive note. So we ask all guests the same question, which is what makes you optimistic about the future?
By nature, I'm an optimist at heart. And so otherwise I wouldn't be, doing what it is that I'm doing. I do believe that technology is what it is that's going to really propel this industry forward and drive it into the future, and continue to help me be relevant, as a family, as a company, within the industry and within the broader kind of global context. And what makes me really optimistic is the fact that today we're seeing many more founders look at mining as a use case that they attacked from the get-go, rather than what it was several years ago, where you had many very interesting companies where they were working on solutions for other industries, but just like a side kind of potential use case, way down the priority list was mining, right? And then whereas now you have a lot of these founders who are super smart, super driven, and ultimately, have the potential to be very well funded, who are looking at mining right from day one. And that gives me a lot of hope, because what that means is that, with more and more people looking at mining as a use case, as a potential, industry to work in and to help solve problems for, we're going to have only better and better, companies come in, better technologies, better founders, more capital, which ultimately is going to take this industry forward. Because at the end of the day, I mean, this is it. I mean, mining is what builds everything else that we need for the future, right? Without your building blocks, you're not really going to be able to build anything above it. And that's where mining comes in. And so if you have so much of this enthusiasm as we are seeing now, I think the future is super bright, not just for mining, but really everything else that's going to be built that depends on mining. And so for me personally, I mean, it's a super privileged position to be in, to be able to work in this space that's essentially going to be this backbone, for the industrialized future as we know it, or as we predict.
Vivek, thank you so much for joining us today on What's Next, and for giving us this picture about how innovation is going to reshape mining and what this ultimately means for each and every one of us and the future of technology and sustainability as well. Thank you very much.
Great. No, thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.